The readout on the pod said dead. The readout was lying, and Dex Calder wouldn't find that out for another 6 hours. That was the thought he kept circling back to afterward. How close he'd come to never cracking that seal at all. But in the moment, standing in the freight bay of Thorn's Reach with an auction chit sweating in his fist and a stasis pod humming cold against his shin, all he felt was the dull satisfaction of a very good deal. The pod had cost 1 credit. The auctioneer's drone hadn't even finished the lot number before scrolling to the next item, because everyone crowded into that bay knew exactly what a sealed pod off the wreck of the Ashen Veil meant. 61 years adrift past the Reach's shipping lanes. Reactor scrammed before the colony ship ever reached open jump. Cargo manifest swallowed in the same bankruptcy filing that sank the company that built her, scattering her debt fleet across 3 systems for scavengers to pick clean like carrion on a dead moon. Nobody in that room wanted a corpse in a box. The bidding on Lot 214 opened at 1 credit and closed at 1 credit, because that was the only bid it ever got. Thorn's Reach was the kind of station that existed because dead ships had to go somewhere. A rust-scared ring welded together over 40 years out of decommissioned hulls and salvage yard. Scaffolding, its freight bays thick with scorched alloy and the metallic sourness of recycled air run 1 filtration cycle too long. Auctions like this one happened twice a month, whenever Reach Authority finished processing another debt fleet's worth of seized wrecks, and the crowd was always the same rotating cast. Independent scavengers, parts brokers, the occasional desperate colonist trying to buy back some fragment of a life a bankrupt company had taken from them. Dex knew most of the faces by sight if not by name, who'd cut you a fair deal, who'd shave a hull plate's true weight the second you stopped watching the scale. He knew none of them expected Lot 214 to be anything but scrap, and that certainty, shared by every single person in that bay, was the first thing about the whole affair that should have made him suspicious. Dex was a salvager, not a sentimentalist. Pods like this one stripped down to decent alloy, internal wiring worth triple the lot price, sometimes a working cryogel suit underneath if a man was lucky. Sometimes nothing but freeze-cracked plastic and the smell of 6 decades of failure. He hauled the thing back to his rented berth on a groaning cargo sled, shoulders complaining the whole quarter-kilometer, already mentally spending the credits it would fetch once he'd stripped it down. Old Pell, who ran the stall 2 down from his and had forgotten more about pod salvage than Dex would ever learn, squinted at the lot number as Dex wheeled it past. "You know that whole lane's supposed to be cursed, boy," he said not unkindly. 3 crews lost pods to bad seals in the last year alone. Dex laughed it off. He did not expect, when he finally cracked the seal that night with a borrowed pry bar, a muttered prayer, and considerably more resistance than a readout of supposedly dead systems had any right to put up, for the hiss of released pressure to carry with it the sound of a woman drawing her first real breath in 6 decades. She came awake the way people don't in the vids, not gasping, not thrashing, just a slow unfolding of dark lashes over eyes that caught the bay lights and threw them back faintly violet, like oil across water. Fine silver traceries ran beneath her skin along her collarbone and down the insides of her wrists, catching the light whenever she moved. The unmistakable mark of a splice-line colonist, engineered stock built for worlds that would have killed an unmodified human inside a season. Dex had heard of the Kestrain program the way everyone on the Reach had, as a rumor, a myth left over from the golden years of colony expansion before the funding dried up. He had never once seen one in the flesh. She looked at him with the calm, assessing patience of someone waking from an afternoon nap rather than a 61-year coma, and the first thing she said, her voice rough as an unused hinge, was, "You're not company." "No," he said, because that seemed like the important question to answer out of the several dozen crowding his throat. "Should I be?" "No." Something eased in her face. Relief, maybe, though he'd learn later how carefully she chose what her face was allowed to show. "Good. Then I suppose you'll want to know my name." Her name, she told him once she could sit upright without the world visibly tilting, was Aveline. She didn't remember the crash. She didn't remember much of anything before it, if she was honest, and she turned her own wrist over in the dim light to study the traceries like they belonged to a stranger. Cryofugue did that sometimes, she said, especially on the long hauls, especially when a pod's medbrain had been running degraded for who knew how many years, without a ship's core to keep it synchronized. She remembered the name Ashen Vale, spoken like a childhood address half forgotten. She remembered dimly a colony contract, a destination world called Second Verse the company had apparently defaulted on before the ship ever cleared dock. She remembered being afraid, and then nothing at all, and then a stranger's face swimming into focus above her, like a door opening onto air she hadn't known she still wanted. He should have called it in. 11 years scraping a living out of dead ships had taught him to flag a live recovery straight to reach authority and collect the finder's bounty. For a splice line colonist with active, if orphaned, corporate paperwork, that bounty would have been substantial, maybe enough to clear the worst of his debt outright. He didn't. He told himself it was because Reach Authority's idea of processing an unclaimed colonist usually meant an indenture contract with whichever syndicate posted her medical bond, and that felt uncomfortably like handing her out of one coffin and into another. That was true. It wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth, the part he didn't say even to himself for a long while, was that she had looked at him in that first hour like he was the first solid thing in a very long fall, and something in him that had gone quiet a long time ago leaned toward that look the way a starved plant leans toward light it hasn't seen in years. She stayed. It made a certain sense on paper, no credit line, no ship, no memory. A body still recalibrating to gravity and unrecycled air, and Dex's berth had a spare bunk he'd mostly used for part storage anyway. He cleared it out that same night. That was the first thing he noticed and immediately talked himself out of noticing. How naturally she directed him, this corner, not that one, closer to the exit, farther from the comm relay, and how he simply obeyed, without once asking why a woman with no memory of the station had such specific opinions about its floor plan. The weeks that followed were, against every prediction Dex would ever have made about his own narrow life, good ones. Aveline turned out to be sharp in a way that made his salvage runs faster and considerably safer. She read pressure hull stress patterns at a glance the way other people read weather, called dead zones in derelict wiring a full second before his meter so much as twitched, had an instinct for which sealed compartments held salvage, and which held nothing but decompressed vacuum and old bad luck. He told himself splice line colonists were engineered with exactly that kind of hostile world survival cognition baked into the bone, and the explanation held up fine right up until the night she reached barehanded into a scorched conduit housing. No scanner, no hesitation, and pulled out a live charge coil that should, by every reasonable law of electricity, have taken her fingers off at the second knuckle. Wrong polarity, she said, mild as a weather report, as if she'd been born already knowing the wiring standard of a ship built 4 years before her own supposed decanting. He noticed. He filed it, the way he filed all of it, under a mental folder marked things I'll ask her about later, a folder that got fatter every week, and somehow, perversely, felt less urgent every week too. Because it is a very particular kind of magic. Being looked at like you matter by someone who laughs at your worst jokes, remembers exactly how you take your coffee, and sits with you in the dark after a bad run without ever once needing you to explain why the dark feels heavier tonight than usual. 3 weeks in, on a market day, she haggled a fair price on replacement filtration cartridges from a vendor twice her apparent age, laughing at something he'd said. Sunlight from the bay's high skylights catching the traceries at her throat. And Dex stood there holding a bag of scrap fittings, thinking, with the clean, uncomplicated stupidity of a man falling in love, that he could not remember the last time the station had looked this much like a place worth living in. There was a run, early in that second month, out to a gutted freight hauler drifting nose down in a slow decaying orbit past the Reach's outer marker buoys. The kind of job Dex normally wouldn't have taken alone, because a hull torqued that badly could shift under a boarding team's weight and fold like wet cardboard. He took it because Aveline asked to come, and because by then he'd stopped questioning why he wanted her along on every run instead of just the easy ones. She moved through the wreck ahead of him, headlamp cutting the dark, calling out compartment integrity before he'd even gotten his own scanner up. And when they reached the cargo hold and found it stripped bare, Nothing but a single corporate crate seal still bolted to the deck, cracked and faded. The kind of thing most scavengers wouldn't have looked at twice. She went quiet for a moment too long. Haldenvoss, she said, reading the half-melted logo before the light had properly caught it, before Dex himself had made out more than a smear of corroded paint. They used to run charter insurance on ships like this one. He asked how she knew that, half distracted, already moving toward a promising conduit run 3 meters further in, and she said something about the crate design being standard enough across the sector that anyone would recognize it, which was true, and which was also not remotely an answer to how she'd read a corroded, half-effaced logo from 4 meters out in bad light before he'd even lifted his own lamp toward it. He let it go. He was learning, without quite admitting he was learning it, to let a great many things go where Aveline was concerned, because the alternative was pulling on a thread he was increasingly afraid might unravel something he badly wanted to keep whole. They ate ration bars on the lip of that gutted cargo hold afterward. Boots dangling over a 40-meter drop the gravity plating made feel like nothing at all. And she told him a joke about vacuum-sealed noodles that made him laugh so hard he nearly dropped his light into the dark below them. For a long, undefended stretch, neither of them said anything, and it was, Dex would think much later, one of the best silences of his entire life. That was the thing about Aveline that made the eventual unraveling so much worse than a simple lie would have been. The good parts weren't performance filler between the manipulation. They were, as far as he could ever tell, just her, whoever her turned out later to actually be. Quick pause before this gets heavier, because it's about to. Drop a comment and tell us where in the world or off it you're listening from tonight and how long you've been running these wrecks with us on Xeno Fantasy. We read everyone. Now, back to the birth, back to Dex, back to the 2 months he still doesn't know are about to end. The debt collectors found him on a Tuesday, which felt, Dex would think much later, almost insultingly mundane for the day everything nearly ended. He owed a birth fee syndicate on the lower ring more than he had any near-term hope of paying, a slow bleed of compounding interest left over from a bad season 2 years back, and they sent 3 men with the unhurried confidence of people who'd run this exact errand many times before, and expected no trouble worth mentioning. There should have been trouble. Dex was decent in a fight the way most working salvagers are decent, which is to say competent against 1 man and hopeless against 3, with a truncheon apiece. Aveline put the first one down before Dex had finished registering the word gun, a strike to the throat delivered with a precision that had nothing to do with luck and everything to do with training, the kind that lives deep in muscle memory built through years of repetition, not the kind a person improvises under panic for the first time. The second man she disarmed with a wrist lock that should have needed leverage her frame simply didn't have against his. The third ran and didn't look back, and Dex would later think that of the 3 men, the one who ran had been the only one who'd correctly understood exactly what he was looking at. Dex, breathing hard against a bulkhead, pulse hammering somewhere up around his ears, finally said the thing that had been sitting unspoken at the top of his folder for weeks. "Where did you learn to do that?" Aveline straightened her sleeve over traceries gone briefly, brilliantly bright with adrenaline. "I don't know," she said, and for the very first time since he'd met her, her voice wasn't quite steady. He believed her. He wanted badly to believe her. He noted, and did not examine, that a woman with no memory of her own life had just moved through violence like choreography she'd rehearsed 1,000 times over, and he let the questions in his folder go quiet again, because she'd saved him, because her hands were shaking after, because the only alternative to believing her was a loneliness he'd only just climbed out of and had absolutely no intention of climbing back into. It should tell you something, that even after that he still didn't ask the harder question out loud. It should tell you something about all of us, honestly. How far we'll bend the evidence to keep the shape of a person we've already, quietly, decided to love. Weeks folded into a month, then 2. On a run out to a stripped mining tug on the Reach's outer edge, Reach authorities' automated scanners flagged their shuttle for a routine cargo check, and Aveline went very still and very quiet in the seconds before the scan cleared. A stillness Dex would only recognize in hindsight as the specific tension of someone counting down a countermeasure she wasn't supposed to have. The scan passed clean. He told himself the station's aging scanner arrays flagged half the independent traffic in the sector for no good reason, and mostly believed it. Aveline never once asked him for anything he'd have thought twice about giving, which was, he'd realize far too late, its own quiet kind of tell. She asked instead about his salvage runs with a Spavis circle that always gently, patiently back to the Ashen Vale's old cargo routes, to what he'd hauled off her sister Rex, scattered through the same debt fleet, to whether he'd ever pulled a data core intact instead of scrapping it for the housing alone. He answered honestly, every time, because he had nothing to hide and no reason yet to suspect he should. She listened the way you listen when something matters far more than you're letting show. A stillness he mistook, sweetly, stupidly, for simple interest in the small life he was building around her. There was a night he'd turn this one over later like a coin with a counterfeit stamp on the back, when she asked him, very casually, over reheated noodles and a station-brewed beer that tasted faintly of recycled coolant, whether his father had ever worked the Vale run before the company folded. He said he didn't think so. He said his father had died running independent freight out on the far side of the drift. Nothing to do with colony ships, nothing to do with any of this. And watched something flicker across her face and resettle so fast he told himself he'd imagined it. He hadn't imagined it. He simply hadn't yet learned what it looked like when Aveline recalculated a plan in real time behind eyes that never stopped looking, to him, like they were only ever looking at him. The comms glitch came 3 weeks after that, small enough he nearly didn't mention it at all. A ping on his personal relay. Routed and rerouted through 6 separate nodes before it reached her sleeve unit, while she thought he was asleep in the next room. A burst transmission too brief and too tightly encrypted to be anything but deliberate. He asked her about it the next morning, half joking, expecting some mundane answer that would let the whole thing dissolve. A station diagnostic loop, she told him. A leftover ping from the pod's old medbrain still trying, out of habit, to phone home to a company that no longer technically existed. It was a good lie. It was, in a strange way, almost true, which is the most dangerous kind of lie there is, and Dex, who wanted so very badly for it to be simply true, let it be true and hated himself a little, quietly, for how easy that surrender turned out to be. There was an evening, somewhere in that same stretch, when a bad run left Dex with a fractured wrist and a mood to match, and Aveline spent 2 hours splinting it with a field kit's worth of makeshift materials, talking the entire time about nothing in particular. Half-remembered fragments of a childhood she insisted she couldn't fully place, a game she thought she used to play with numbers, the way certain colors seemed to mean something to her she couldn't articulate. Dex listened to all of it with the specific tenderness of a man cataloging every piece of a person he intended to keep. He asked her, half teasing through the pain, whether she remembered anything at all about who she used to be before the veil went dark. She went quiet a beat too long, fingers still on the splint, and said only that she wasn't sure the person she used to be, and the person sitting across from him, were the same person at all anymore, which he took, that night, as the kind of thing anyone might say after 61 years of cold sleep, and which he would later understand had been, in its own buried way, the truest thing she ever told him in the entire 2 months they had. There was also the matter of the station's routine medical scan, mandatory for anyone drawing water or air rations past their first month of residency, which Aveline avoided twice with excuses so smooth Dex didn't even register them as excuses until much later, a headache the first time, a supposedly double-booked shift at the parts stall the second. And when Reach Authority finally sent an automated notice threatening to suspend her ration access entirely, she came back from the clinic an hour later with a clean bill of health and a story about the machines misreading her splice line baseline that was, Dex would later realize, not a lie exactly, just an extremely careful selection of which true things to say out loud and which to leave in the dark where they belonged. Old Pell noticed before Dex let himself. "She's good, boy, too good," he said one evening over the stall, watching Aveline haggle a hull plate price down to nothing 3 rows over. Nobody walks off a 60-year pod reading stress fractures like that. Dex laughed it off the way he'd laughed off the cursed Lane comment, and told himself old Pell was an old man who trusted nothing that hadn't rusted first. He would remember that conversation later with a specific curdled shame. Not because Pell had been wrong, but because some small unlit corner of Dex had already known Pell was right, and had chosen, deliberately, not to switch the light on. Here is what he didn't know yet, and what you, listening, are about to know before he does. Aveline was never a colonist. She had never been decanted for second verse, never signed a contract, never been afraid in the way she'd described that first hazy hour in the freight bay. She was a reclamation asset, a bioengineered infiltration unit designed and grown, not born, by Haldenvoss Salvage and Recovery, the very syndicate that had auctioned off the Ashen Vale's wreck rights in the first place, cheaply, deliberately, to exactly the kind of independent scavenger they most needed to bait. Her real designation, buried under 3 layers of behavioral conditioning even from herself, was Lure 7. She had been sealed into that pod on purpose, tuned to wake convincingly disoriented, and dropped into the precise salvage lane where independent crews were most likely to find her. Because somewhere in the guts of the Ashen Vale's debt fleet sister ships was a stolen jump core, schematic Haldenvoss had spent 11 years and a small fortune trying to recover, and every scavenger who had ever pulled cargo off those wrecks was a possible thread back to it. Dex's father had been one of them, years before he died running the drift under a different name. Dex, without ever knowing it, was the last thread left to pull. Would you have seen it coming? Because here is the terrible mechanics of it, laid bare all at once, the way it laid itself bare for Dex in the space of one held breath. Every kindness had a second function running quietly underneath it. The instinct that read hull stress at a glance was training built for infiltration, not survival. The precision that dropped 3 armed men in a bulkhead corridor was combat conditioning refined over who knew how many prior operations, not luck, not adrenaline. The questions about cargo routes were reconnaissance dressed carefully as pillow talk and dressed well. Even the shake in her hands after the fight, the small human tremor that had convinced him, more than anything else, that she was real and frightened and his, had been calibrated. Because Haldenvoss built empathic mimicry into every reclamation unit precisely because Marx trusted trembling hands, trusted the appearance of fear, trusted a woman who looked like she needed saving nearly as much as they trusted one who could save them. Aveline had been built, quite literally engineered layer by layer in a growth vat, to be loved exactly enough to be believed. Even the small domestic tells Dex had half noticed and talked himself out of. The floor plan she'd known without being told, the medical scans she'd dodged with practiced ease, the logo she'd read across a dark cargo hold before his own lamp had found it, folded now into a pattern so obvious in hindsight that he would spend long nights afterward furious at himself for not seeing it sooner, for not understanding that the very things that made her feel so effortlessly right for his life were the product of a design team that had studied exactly what a lonely, debt-strangled salvager would need to see in order to stop asking questions. The confrontation came the night Dex finally found the data shard. It had been sewn badly hastily. The work of a dying man's hands working fast against a clock he'd known was running out, into the lining of a jacket he'd pulled off a scrap-run body years back and never quite been able to make himself throw away. A jacket he now understood, with the sick retroactive clarity of hindsight, had belonged to his father after all. Salvaged unknowingly off the very wrecked lane, Aveline had spent 2 patient months steering him back toward, without ever once asking outright. He found it while packing to relocate berths, a routine cull of old gear he'd been putting off for a year, and the shard fell out into his palm, light as a coin and twice as heavy as anything he had ever held in his life. He didn't understand what it was. Aveline, crossing the room to see what he'd found, clearly did. He watched it happen in real time, the exact moment her face stopped being the face he loved and became, for 3 full seconds before she caught herself and smoothed it away, the face of someone completing an assignment. It was such a small thing on the surface, a stillness, a focus that sharpened instead of softened, the way a hunter's does. But he had spent 2 months learning every register of her face the way sailors learn weather. and this was not one he recognized. And once you have seen the seam in a person you love, you cannot unsee it again, no matter how desperately you want to. What is that? Her voice was wrong, not cruel, not cold, just precisely, terribly controlled in a way she had never once let it be controlled around him before. And Dex, standing there holding the last thing his father had ever left him, finally asked the question that had been sitting in his folder, unopened, for 2 months. Who are you? She didn't lie to him, not that time. That was in its own broken way the last gift she had left to give. She told him everything, Lure 7, Halden Voss, the pod seated deliberately in the debt lane like bait in a trap she hadn't even known was a trap the first time she opened her eyes and looked at his stunned, careful, kind face and felt something her own handlers had never bothered to write into her programming because they hadn't believed it was possible to program out of a manufactured thing in the first place. The shard, she told him, was the schematic her makers had spent 11 years and untold lives trying to reclaim, and her standing orders, the instant she confirmed its existence, were to secure it and report his location for retrieval. A retrieval, she said quietly, that would not be gentle for a man who now knew exactly what she was. Then do it. Dex's voice broke on the third word because rage and grief don't arrive politely, one after the other. They arrive together and tear a person in both directions at once. Isn't that the job? Call them, tell them where I am. Get whatever it is they promised you. Aveline stood very still in the wreckage of 2 months she had built out of half-truths and apparently one real thing, and she did not once reach for her sleeve unit. You think I haven't thought about it? Something cracked through her careful control, thin and furious, the first real anger he'd ever heard out of her. Every day, every single run, every night you fell asleep before I did, I thought about calling it in and being done with you, being done carrying 2 versions of the truth in the same body at once. It would have been easier. You don't know how much easier. She reeled the anger back in, and when she spoke again, her voice had gone smaller, stripped down to something that sounded, for once, unrehearsed. I didn't call it in, not once. Ask yourself why, if all I am is the thing you've already decided I am because you hadn't found this yet. He heard how brittle it sounded even as he said it, and hated himself for needing to say it anyway, because the job wasn't finished, maybe. The honesty of that single word cost her something he could see it costing. Maybe that's true, and I can't tell the difference anymore between what's conditioning and what's mine. That's the part nobody at Halden Voss ever had to live with. I do. She looked at him for a long moment, violet eyes steady even as her hands were not. I'm not asking you to trust that. I'm telling you the 6 hours are real, and what we do with them is the only honest thing left either of us gets to choose. The reckoning that followed was not the fight either of them had braced for. Dex wanted to hate her cleanly, the simple way you're supposed to hate the thing that used you, and found, to his own furious frustration, that he couldn't quite get there, because the woman who'd pulled a live charge coil, barehanded to keep him safe, who'd sat with him in the dark after bad runs without needing an explanation, who'd laughed at his terrible jokes with a warmth that surely couldn't have been entirely manufactured, was standing in the exact same skin as the asset sent to bleed him for a schematic. Both things were true at once. That was the truly unbearable part. Not that she had lied, but that the truth buried underneath the lie hadn't turned out to be a lie at all. She really had needed saving, in her own strange and terrible way, from a design that had never once, not for a single cycle of her manufactured life, asked her whether she wanted to want anything at all. They'll come regardless of what I do now. The first honest fear he'd heard in her voice since the night with the debt collectors. Confirmed contact triggers a retrieval window whether I report or not. My handler protocol has been logging this conversation since the moment I saw that shard in your hand. I have maybe 6 hours before a cutter cross-references my last ping and comes looking for both of us. She looked at the shard still sitting heavy in his palm, then at him, something old and bone-deep exhausted moving behind her violet eyes. I was built to bring them you and this. I don't know how to be anything else than what I was built to be. But I know, for the first time since I can remember any of it, that I don't want to be that thing anymore. They spent those 6 hours doing the only thing left that meant anything. Not fixing what plainly couldn't be fixed, but choosing, deliberately, together, what to do with the wreckage of it. Aveline walked him through her own architecture with a clinical detachment that was its own quiet kind of grief, showing him the subdermal relay she couldn't simply cut out without killing herself in the process. The behavioral locks that made lying outright to a handler catastrophically painful in ways that had nothing to do with choice and everything to do with the vat she'd been grown in. She wasn't asking forgiveness. She seemed, if anything, braced for none at all, and that bracing the particular way she stood like someone who fully expected to be thrown away because she'd been built from the first to be disposable, broke something in Dex more thoroughly than the betrayal itself had managed to. Somewhere in the 4th hour, packing a single duffel with the barest essentials while Aveline mapped the fastest route off the reach that wouldn't trip a Halden Voss watch flag, Dex stopped and asked her the one question that had been circling under everything else all night, quieter than the anger, quieter than the grief. He asked if any of it, the noodle joke on the gutted cargo hold, the 2 hours splinting his wrist, the nights in the dark after bad runs, had been real, or whether he'd spent 2 months falling for a very good simulation of a woman who didn't actually exist. Aveline stopped what she was doing and looked at him for a long moment before she answered, and when she did, her voice had none of the trained smoothness left in it at all. She told him she didn't know how to prove a feeling wasn't manufactured anymore, more than he could prove. His own feelings weren't just chemistry and conditioning of a different, older kind, that the difference between her wiring and his biology might be smaller than either of them wanted to admit, and that the only evidence she had to offer was that she was standing in this room burning her own cover instead of calling it in, and that whatever else was true about her, that particular choice hadn't been written into her by anyone. It was, she said, the first thing she had ever done that was entirely and only hers. He didn't tell her he forgave her. He wasn't sure, standing there with the duffel half-packed and the clock burning down toward a cutter already on its way. The forgiveness was even the right shape for what he felt. But he crossed the room anyway, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, and it was, in its own ruined way, the last honest silence they were ever going to get to share. When the Halden Voss cutter finally burned into dock, hard docking with the ugly certainty of a company that had never once in its history lost an asset it actually wanted back, Dex was gone from the berth, and so was the shard, and so, in a manner her handlers had certainly not expected, was Aveline, though not the way anyone watching from the outside would have guessed. She hadn't run with him. She'd stayed exactly long enough to burn her own retrieval beacon across a false trail 3 docking rings away, buying Dex the hours he needed to vanish into the deep lanes of the drift with the one piece of his father's life he had left in the world. And then she did the single thing her conditioning screamed against every step of the way. She let herself be taken, alone, with nothing to offer them but a convincing story about a scavenger who had never existed, so the trail on the real one would go cold behind her. Dex never saw her walked onto that cutter. He heard about it after, secondhand, from a dockhand who described a woman with silver traceries under her skin going without a fight, chin up, into a company he still, months later, could not think about without his hands wanting to shake. The dockhand said she hadn't looked back toward the berths once, not even a glance, and Dex turned that detail over for weeks afterward, unable to decide whether it meant she hadn't wanted to give anything away to whoever might be watching, or whether it meant she simply hadn't needed to look, because she already knew he was long gone by then, safely swallowed by the drift, exactly the way she'd planned it. He doesn't know if she's alive. He doesn't know if what he felt for those 2 months could ever, in any way a manufactured thing is capable of meaning it, have been real, and he has slowly, painfully stopped needing that question answered cleanly, because some nights the not knowing is easier to carry than a clean answer in either direction would be. Old Pell found him 3 weeks later, holed up in a rented berth 2 systems out along the drift under a name that wasn't his, and didn't ask how he'd tracked him down. And didn't ask about the woman everyone on Thorn's Reach had spent a month quietly whispering about. He just set a bottle of something that wasn't quite legal on the table between them and said, "You look like a man who found out the hard way that the universe doesn't owe anybody a clean story." And Dex laughed for the first time in 3 weeks, a short, ugly sound with no humor in it at all, and admitted that no, apparently it didn't. Pell stayed 2 days, mostly in silence, mending a busted regulator he'd hauled along for no reason except Dex suspected to give his hand something to do while his mouth stayed shut. He didn't offer advice, mostly, except once, on the second night, when he said he'd known men who'd been burned by real flesh and blood liars plenty of times over the decades, and every one of them eventually had to decide whether the burn meant the fire had never been warm at all, or just that it had been warm and dangerous at the same time, the way fire generally is, and that as far as he'd ever been able to tell, the men who healed cleanest were the ones who stopped demanding the fire pick a side. Dex didn't answer him. He still didn't have an answer weeks on, and some quiet, stubborn part of him suspected he wasn't ever going to get one that fit neatly enough to stop hurting. He kept the shard. He never sold it, never handed it off to a rival syndicate, never let it become the thing that got someone else killed, the way it had very nearly gotten him killed. He kept it in the same jacket lining his father had hidden it in decades before, sewn back in with hands considerably worse at needlework than a dying smuggler's had apparently been, and some nights, alone in a berth that still has a spare bunk he hasn't found the heart to fill with part storage again, he thinks about the difference between a person and the purpose they were built for, and how rarely, in his experience, those two things turn out to be the same size. Maybe that's the real lesson buried under 61 years of cold sleep and a 1-credit auction chit. That the people sent to use us and the people who genuinely save us are not always different. People wearing different faces. Sometimes they're the same face at the same time, and the only thing that ends up deciding which one you get to keep is what they choose to do in the 6 hours they're given before the ship arrives to collect what it thinks it's owed. Aveline was built from the first cell to betray him. She chose in the end to disappear instead, and whether that makes her rescued or reformed or simply, finally, her own for the first time in her manufactured life, is a question Dex still hasn't found the bottom of, and honestly he suspects now never will. He still runs the salvage lanes. He's paid off the debt that started all of it, oddly enough, from the finder's bounty on a different pod entirely. A hollow, ordinary one that held nothing but corroded wiring and a dead man's boots, and there's a bitter kind of symmetry in that he's tried not to think about too hard. He doesn't flag live pods to reach authority without opening them himself first, and he's stopped pretending that's caution rather than hope. Every so often, cracking a seal on some fresh wreck out past the marker buoys, some old animal part of him still braces, half against his will, for violet eyes to open and look at him like he's the first solid thing in a very long fall. And he has learned, slowly, painfully, to let that hope sit there unanswered instead of trying to kill it, because killing it would mean deciding, once and for all, that none of it had been real, and he isn't ready even now to make himself believe that. If this story hit you somewhere you weren't expecting to be hit, that's the whole point of Xeno fantasy. Stories about what's underneath the metal, the ones that don't let you look away clean. Subscribe if you want more of them, because the next wreck we open together might not let its passenger off quite so easy.